Almighty God, you've heard our prayers, cries of our hearts, for those we love and care about, the people of this world, and for our own selves to be right with you. We thank you for your great mercy and your kindness towards us. May you continue to pour out your Holy Spirit upon us this Sabbath day, Lord. The messages that you have given us, the holy oil from heaven, may they sink into our hearts and minds. We've been so slow, Lord, so slow to understand. We've been neglectful. And we just ask you for your grace to continue upon us, that you would kindle a fire in our hearts and renew such a spirit in us that we've never had before for your truth, to strive for understanding, to believe in your messenger, to be able to have all the lines come together for clarity. May we have patience in your leading and not try to jump ahead of you, but to understand the light we're given. And may we be faithful and endure to the end. As we continue our review, help us as we go through this history with Henry Clay. And may we receive a blessing of understanding as you've blessed us through many of our reviews, Lord. We thank you and we praise you and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Oops, there we go. Okay, so this is picking up where we left off last night, where she was just starting to go into Henry Clay. So reviewing the Missouri Compromise, 1818 to 1820, in an effort to preserve the balance of power in Congress between slave and free states, the Missouri Compromise was passed in 1820, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. Furthermore, with the exception of Missouri, this law prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of 3630 latitude line. In 1854, the Missouri Compromise was repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. 3 years later, the Missouri Compromise was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that Congress did not have the authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Clay was the main orchestrator behind the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, and was a prominent leader in politics from 1820 until the time of his death. This just shows a map of the territory here. We're not going to be able to read that. I don't know if any of you can read that, but I know I can't today. Okay, and then the second compromise tariff, the compromise tariff of 1833. These are three compromises that Henry Clay was responsible for. So the definition and summary, the compromise tariff of 1833 was proposed by Henry Clay with the cooperation of John C. Calhoun to defuse the gravity of the nullification crisis. The compromise tariff was passed by Congress in March 1833 and gradually lowered the tariff rates over the next 10 years until in 1842, they would be as low as when they were by the Tariff Act of 1816. The compromise tariff ended the nullification crisis. After he lost both the fight over the bank and his second bid for the presidency, Clay addressed South Carolina nullification crisis with his compromise tariff of 1833, which gradually lowered tariffs over the following 10 years. Although the controversy was ostensibly about South Carolina's refusal to collect federal tariffs, many historians believe it was actually rooted in growing Southern fears over the North's abolition movement. Clay was able to prevent a serious confrontation as defiant South Carolinians were taking up arms and Jackson was threatening force. So we saw last night's study as well, where Jefferson, it was the Missouri conflict, I think, or compromise, I believe, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that Jefferson said was like a fire bell in the night and saw where it was headed. So they were increasingly going towards this place. These are more Wikipedia. Some of them are from Wikipedia, not just older tests. So the Compromise of 1850 was a package of 5 separate bills passed by the United States Congress in September 1850 that defused a political confrontation between slave and free states on the status of territories acquired in the Mexican-American War. It also set Texas' western and northern borders and included provisions addressing fugitive slaves and the slave trade. The compromise was brokered by Whig Senator Henry Clay and Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas with the support of President Millard Fillmore. A debate over slavery in the territories had erupted during the Mexican-American War, as many Southerners sought to expand slavery to the newly acquired lands, and many Northerners opposed any such expansion. The debate was further complicated by Texas' claim to all former Mexican territory north and east of the Rio Grande, including areas it had never effectively controlled. These issues prevented the passage of organic acts to create organized territorial governments for the land acquired in the Mexican-American War. In early 1850, Clay proposed a package of bills that would settle most of the pressing issues before Congress. Clay's proposal was opposed by President Zachary Taylor, anti-slavery Whigs like William Seward, and pro-slavery Democrats like John C. Calhoun, and congressional debate over the territories continued. After Taylor died and was succeeded by Fillmore, Douglas took the lead in passing Clay's compromise through Congress as 5 separate bills. Under the compromise, Texas surrendered its claims to present-day New Mexico and other states in return for federal assumption of Texas public debt. California was admitted as a free state, while the remaining portions of the Mexican cession were organized into New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory. Under the concept of popular sovereignty, the people of each territory would decide whether or not slavery would be permitted. The compromise also included a more stringent fugitive slave law and banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The issue of slavery in the territories would be reopened by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but many historians argue that the Compromise of 1850 played a major role in postponing the American Civil War. Fugitive Slave Law. One statute of the Compromise of 1850, enacted September 18, 1850, is informally known as the Fugitive Slave Law or the Fugitive Slave Act. It bolstered the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The new version of the Fugitive Slave Law required federal judicial officials in all states and federal territories, including in those states and territories in which slavery was prohibited, to assist with the return of escaped slaves to their masters actively in the states and territories permitting slavery. Any federal marshal or other official who did not arrest an alleged runaway slave was liable to a fine of $1,000. Law enforcement everywhere in the US had a duty to arrest anyone suspected of being a fugitive slave on no more evidence than the claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. Suspected slaves could neither ask for a jury trial nor testify on their own behalf. Also, any person aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was to be subject to 6 months imprisonment and a $1,000 fine. Officers capturing a fugitive slave were entitled to a fee for their work. In addition to federal officials, the ordinary citizens of free states could be summoned to join a posse and be required to assist in the capture, custody, and/or transportation of the alleged escaped slave. The law was so rigorously pro-slavery as to prohibit the admission of the testimony of a person accused of being an escaped slave into evidence at the judicial hearing to determine the status of the accused escaped slave. Thus, if a freedman were claimed to be an escaped slave, they could not resist their return to slavery by truthfully telling their actual history. Fugitive Slave Act was essential to meet Southern demands. In terms of public opinion in the North, the critical provision was that ordinary citizens were required to aid slave catchers. Many Northerners deeply resented that requirement to help slavery personally. Resentment towards the act continued to heighten tensions between the North and the South, which were inflamed further by abolitionists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, stressed the horrors of recapturing escaped slaves and outraged Southerners. So we've got the freed states up here, the slave states without Texas claims to New Mexico, the territories, and the Missouri Compromise line at the 3630 parallel. The states and territories of the United States in 1850. Which ones are states and which ones are territories, and then other countries in disputed areas. So we're continuing on from our previous study, and we'll first do a short review. We'll include a couple of thoughts that weren't mentioned in the previous study. They're not new thoughts, this is just a reminder. There are set periods where they can see that there was a particular development in US politics in how political parties were structured and organized. We have the first party system, the second party system, and the third party system. They are the three that overlap with our reform line. We're focusing mostly on the second party system, which was predominantly the Whig Party here versus the Democrat Party. The Whig Party fell apart in the 1850s, and a branch of that became the Republican Party. I think this is still Wikipedia here as well. Washington continues to advance his idea. Yeah, this is George Washington continues to advance his idea of the dangers of sectionalism and expands his warning to include the dangers of political parties to the contrary as a whole. These warnings are given in the context of the recent rise of two opposing parties within the government, the Democrat-Republican Party led by Jefferson and Hamilton's Federalist Party. Washington had striven to remain neutral during a conflict between Britain and France brought about by the French Revolution, while the Democrat Republicans had made efforts to align with France and the Federalists had made efforts to ally with Great Britain. Washington recognizes that it is natural for people to organize and operate within groups such as political parties, but He also argues that every government has recognized political parties as an enemy and has sought to repress them because of the tendency to seek more power than other groups and to take revenge on political opponents. He feels that disagreements between political parties weakened the government. Moreover, he makes the case that the alternate domination of one party over another and coinciding efforts to exact revenge upon their opponents have led to horrible atrocities, and is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. From Washington's perspective and judgment, political parties eventually and gradually incline the minds of men to seek security in the absolute power of an individual, leading to despotism. He acknowledges the fact that parties are sometimes beneficial in promoting liberty in monarchies, but he argues that political parties must be restrained in a popularly elected government because of their tendency to distract the government from their duties, create unfounded jealousies among groups and regions, raise false alarms among the people, promote riots and insurrection, and provide foreign nations and interests access to the government where they can impose their will upon the country. So those are comments that Washington made about political parties. As we see the first party system, the second party system, and then as we look and reflect on what we see today. So then after about 1855, you had the Democrats versus Republicans, because the Whig Party, part of the Whig Party becomes the Republicans and the Whig Party is gone, but the predecessor of the Republicans was the Whig Party. The parties switched platforms between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. So you had the Republicans, they switched parties between the Civil War and Civil Rights Movement, meaning that what was the Democrats or what was the Democrats then are now the Republicans, and what was the Republicans then are now the Democrats. I hope I said that right. I think you know what I meant. The parties switched platforms between the Civil War and the Civil Rights era. So in the Millerite history, the Democrats were more on the Southern interests and the Whigs and the Republicans on the Northern interests. Particularly early on, there was significant gray areas, but those parties became more and more polarized, just like today. So if you're William Miller or Samuel Snow, you're expecting the Second Advent to be in 1844. As we cover this history, you'll see polarization rising in the 10 to 15 years prior to this history. Slavery is becoming more and more divisive, and the future of the United States hinges on the 1844 election. So you see this polarization happening in the 10 to 15 years before 1844 in this election. So this is a book by John Bicknell titled America 1844. And the first quote she's reading, Miller was confident that Election Day would never take place. While among the politicians in Washington, he wrote that he planned to show them an important revolution will take place before long, which will supersede the necessity of choosing a president by ballot. For the King of Kings will soon be inaugurated into the chair of state. So is Miller particularly focused on the external events? Political events? No, he's expecting Jesus to come. And so the election wasn't important because he's expecting the Second Advent. On October 22nd, 1844 lines up with November 9, 2019. Would we care about the external events of 2019 if Christ was coming in a matter of months? In a history of success, they should have corrected that mistake in time. What we are seeing now is largely, so in a history of success, would we have expected to be paying attention to political events, but we're in a line of success, they would have corrected that mistake in time. What we are seeing now is largely what they should have seen if Samuel Snow had corrected the mistake. Theirs was a line of failure. The second angel, Samuel Snow, did not correct the mistake. So it was a history of failure here. They weren't looking at the political landscape and weren't watching the external events of these 10 to 15 years of this polarization coming. They were looking to October 22nd for the second advent. And October 22nd, 1844 lines up with November 9. And would we be looking at that? So in a history of success, they should have corrected that mistake. So while the mistake was being corrected, I can attest that there's been a slowness to learn and understand. Then on top of that, of necessity, they must have a woman prophet who is also impeded by her own sexism. It says these external events are outside a woman's sphere of influence. Speaking of Ellen White and how she referred to voting in women's rights. We know that she was radical for her time. So to review, we started back from the beginning and we looked at the Constitution. We saw that it was a compromised document in three particular parts. One of those was a fugitive slave clause, though they wrote it in an ambiguous way to disguise the ugly word. But if they didn't mean slavery, they wouldn't have amended that after the Civil War. So the principle of the Fugitive Slave Act was in the Constitution, reinforced by other laws, finally and particularly with the 1850 Compromise. So referring to the, I think it was 1793, the original Fugitive Slave Law. So passed on September 18, 1850 by Congress, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was part of the Compromise of 1850. The act required that slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. So you've got this polarization happening 10 to 15 years before this election of 1844. You have Miller not looking at the election, but saying that Christ is coming, so we don't need to be looking at that. And this issue is over slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act is passed in 1850 that is saying that you must return a slave back to his master. And the government is responsible for finding, returning, and trying the escaped slaves. In 1861, the South makes the following argument. The law and a plain reading of the Constitution is on our side. And if you want to do a plain reading, their arguments are better than that of the North. So 1798, you have a compromised Constitution because the main priority is to hold that union together. Then 1798, Henry Clay does his first political speech. You know, when you think about the Constitution, yes, slavery was written in there, but as we read the quote by Obama last night as well, that it was meant to be a North Star. It was to be a progressive document. People were to come to realize humanity and that how slavery was wrong, but yet you've got people that are, yeah, but it's in the Constitution, so it's okay. So they justify it through it being in the Constitution instead of doing something about it. You've got some people trying to do something about it, and you've got others justifying it because, hey, it's in there, it's in the Constitution. And you just made it, you just confirmed it with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. So we looked at the 1818 Missouri Compromise. Missouri wanted to enter in as a slave state. This wasn't accepted in the North, so Henry Clay linked the request of two states. He brought the request of two states together, and Missouri can enter as a slave state if Maine can enter as a free state. So the Missouri Compromise of 1818, that Missouri can come as a slave state if Maine can enter as a free state, and that was their compromise. John Quincy Adams said the following: I take it for granted that the present question is a mere preamble. It's like the title page of a book, the title page of a great tragic volume. In an effort to preserve the balance of power in Congress between slave and free states, the Missouri Compromise was passed in 1820, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. In 1854, the Missouri Compromise was repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. John Quincy Adams is the eldest son of his father, John Adams Sr. John Adams Sr. was president in 1798. But his son also becomes president, and as John Quincy Adams ages, he becomes more and more against slavery. He says this Missouri Compromise is just the title page or just the introduction. The president thinks that the compromise will take all of this away, but he doesn't believe that. This question, this issue, is now destined to last the extent of their individual and political lives. We need to be clear in this history, and we're hoping we all see more and more clearly. This was not a fight between slaveholders and abolitionists. To be an abolitionist was considered to be a radical extremist. What the North was involved in, what Henry Clay was involved in, was a type of abolition. But what they wanted to do was to end slavery slowly. They just hoped it would gradually end of itself in the South without their effort. People could be abolitionists for different reasons. So you have radical abolitionists. This was not a fight between the slaveholders and the abolitionists. So the majority of the people were in the center, and their position with slavery could be one of the following things. Slavery should end because the Black population is having more and more children. Inevitably, some of them are freed. The races somehow mixed to whatever degree, and that's a bad thing. Freed Black people might take white people's jobs. It's better for white people if slavery ended. And then the popular idea at the time, they put them all back on ships and send them back to Africa. You could be against slavery for racist reasons. This is part of the problem of the Black Lives Matter protesters are raising, because the people that in today's warped history treats as heroes, if you investigate their positions, were no heroes. But there's been a cult of personality, an invention of history wrapped around them. John Quincy Adams was one of the better ones of that history. But if you're an abolitionist in the radical sense of the word, you didn't get far in politics. So this was not anti-racist versus racists for the most part. This was mostly just various extremes of racism in both political parties. But the Whig, then Republican Party, leaned towards abolition, and the Democrat Party leaned towards slavery. Just as you have centrists today, and then a spectrum of left and right, abolition being an absolute extreme position. We discussed 1798, 1818 to 1820, the Missouri Compromise, and now we'll discuss 1833. We mentioned a pro-slavery extremist in our previous study, John C. Calhoun. He was from South Carolina. He was a strong defender of slavery and minority states' rights. In the late 1820s, his views changed more and more radically. The issue of slavery was very closely connected to the issues over the economy. The economy of the North was more dependent upon manufacturing, and the South with slavery on agriculture. Manufacturing being tariffs, and then South with slavery and agriculture. The economy of the North was suffering because the cheap imported goods. If you can buy cheap manufacturing from Britain, it drives down prices of their own manufacturing. So they placed a tariff on imported manufacturing. So you pay extra to import manufactured goods. But in the South, they don't have much manufacturing, so they're importing quite a lot. And as the tariff drives up prices, it hurts their economy. The South takes this personally. John C. Calhoun starts spreading the ideas through the South that there should be conditions on the Southern states staying in the Union. If the government doesn't follow through with the requests of the South, they will secede from the Union. This becomes a genuine risk in that history. I'm not looking at the chat, so is there anything that needs to be brought up that's in the chat? So September 11th, 1830, John C. Calhoun wrote a letter. He says that the tariff is the effect, not the cause of this issue. He says the truth can't be hidden any longer. It's the slavery in the South and the choices she has made in respect to industry that has placed them in this difficult position where their interests are being violated. Interest sacrificed, domestic institutions subordinated themselves, and children reduced to wretchedness. So the North and the South play politics in Congress. They all try to pretend that slavery doesn't exist, that's not a root cause of their issue, that is not a root cause of their issues. John C. Calhoun is quite helpful to us because he had a way of cutting through the political speech and making the issues directly about slavery. He does the same thing in 1844. Whigs and Democrats are arguing about whether or not to annex Texas. Both are diplomatically pretending that this issue has nothing to do with the expansion of slavery. And Calhoun upsets the South when he goes public and says it's all about slavery. It hurt their cause because the South had less of a chance of getting that passed if the North knew it was all about slavery. But Calhoun wanted to push that to the forefront because he wanted slavery to gain the ascendancy and spread. So a compromise tariff was constructed in 1833, proposed by in Union John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. It was considered to save the Union. Also in late 1833, Henry Clay began to have dinners with certain opposition leaders to try and come up with a candidate to oppose Martin Van Buren in the next election. This is considered to be the birth of the Whig Party. It's 1833, compromise tariff and the Whig Party formed. In 1836, the election of the Whigs, the Whigs didn't run one candidate. They ran multiple candidates to try to prevent the Democrat Party from gaining majority. And this is from that book, America 1844. There was another rule introduced into Congress that same year, led by pro-slavery Democrats. It was called the Gag Rule. Gag as in you can't speak. What this rule made happen, what they said, all these irritating abolitionists are sending petitions to Congress, and this subject of abolition prevents us from getting our work done. So they decided that they would not accept any petitions that talked about freeing the slaves. And every time there was a new Congress, John Quincy Adams tried to have that rule removed. So the abolitionists are causing problems and slowing the progress down. It was not successfully removed until 1844. So from 1836 to 1844, you couldn't even approach Congress on the subject of abolition. A Tennessee slaveholder led in the application of that rule, James K. Polk. He was Clay's opponent and victor in the 1844 election. He became the president that annexed Texas to California and Oregon but the Democrats weren't able to pass that rule alone. Whigs were involved. That's the issue of 1833 between the North and the South. To try and make it clearer what we're doing, we're discussing three compromises: 1818 to 1821, the Missouri Compromise; 1833, the tariff; and then 1850, Fugitive Slave Act. There's a number of US elections. You have the 1840, 44, 48, and the 1860 election. We've discussed 1818 to 1821 and then 1833. In the 1840 election, the Whig Party is finally ready to settle on one candidate. The Whig Party leans against slavery, and the Democrat Party for slavery. So they're looking for a candidate, and one of those candidates was General Winfield Scott. He was no great hero for equality, but he had written a letter expressing sympathy for abolitionists. So here's a Whig. He's not great on equality, but he has shown sympathy for the abolitionists. Someone leaked that letter to the Virginia delegation of the Whig Party, the position you might think of as reasonable. If you want to win the election, you don't want an extremist. So he's not given that candidacy. For the position of president, they choose William Henry Harrison, a nice centrist, so they can win the election. Back then, the vice president didn't do much. It was a powerless position. So to win votes in the South, they pick a vice president who's a Southern slave owner, John Tyler. Many Whigs were excited with Harrison because they said there would never be another slaveholding president again. But as a vice president, they choose a slave owner. They felt they had won against slavery with Harrison. They made the right compromises to win the election, but the boat was headed in the right direction. After 1 month in office, Harrison dies. So their victories turned to mourning by their own compromise. John Tyler was a slave-owning Southerner, barely a Whig. He quickly becomes president and throws out all the Whig agenda items. This angers the party so much that they throw him out of the Whig Party while he's president. But all that he does between 1840 and 44 is the result of their own compromise to win more votes in the South. He's the one that brings the annexation of Texas into the public view. The 1844 election, the Whig Party is finally going to nominate their own leader, Henry Clay, against the Democrats' Polk. By 1844, the issue of annexing Texas is a major political question. The Democrats demand it, and the Whigs are against it. So Henry Clay stands against the annexation of Texas, but he wants to win Southern votes. So he's against the annexation of Texas, but he wants to win Southern votes. So he writes a letter to the Southern newspapers, and he says he's not that opposed to annexing Texas, just if the conditions were right. He had some strict conditions, but he showed himself favorable to the idea. The problem is that the letter he wrote to the Southern newspapers is also read by the Northern newspapers. The Northern Whigs that did not want to annex Texas did not want to see the expansion of slavery. They can easily, visibly see that he's compromised and they're angry. So their candidate is compromised. They were able to read the letter that he is in support, not so against annexing Texas. He told the North one thing and the South another thing, and he loses support in his own party because of that. The other attack on him is that he wasn't very religious. He wasn't very moral, the same kind of attack you'd get against a Democrat. They chose a very religious vice president to balance that ticket, but he loses the election. There are a number of reasons he lost the election, but we'll look at 2 of those reasons. He visibly compromised in the letter that he sent to the South on Texas. and the fact that they had not taken a stronger position on slavery splits the vote. And staunch abolitionists vote for a third party, the Liberal Party, the Liberty Party. Quoting now from a short biography portion on Henry Clay, and it's going to be speaking about Polk, the winner. Polk proved to be an extraordinarily successful president, perhaps the most underrated in history. He secured Oregon, California, Texas, and the Southwest in between. It's hard to imagine what the United States may have been without him. But the Mexican War, fought over Texas, and Polk's expansionist policies were the views that ignited the events that led directly to the Civil War. Our reform line, July 1844, would be 2014. And October 44 would be 2019. 1850 is the Sunday Law. And what happened in the 1844 election here directly led to 1850 and led directly to 1861. So what happened in 1844, which is 2019, directly led to the Sunday Law, which directly leads to the close of probation. Going back to the quote, the main result of the war and his huge increase in territory, was set off in Congress a sectional struggle over the expansion of slavery that shattered the political parties and eventually the Union. Some commentators later claimed that had Henry Clay been elected in 1844, there may never have been a civil war. We can't lose sight of the fact that Clay is not the bad guy in all of this. He is not the Trump, the Bannon, the McConnell. We're not making him specifically anyone, but what he symbolizes today. Just a note, Abraham Lincoln is involved in all of this. This 1840 election was radically different than any election held before. It ran on emotional populist campaigns. They won 1840 election, lost 1844, and won 1848. Harrison won by this cult of personality that made him a man of the people. The false idea that he lived in a log cabin was a major part of that cult of personality. Lincoln campaigned for Harrison in 1840. And if you have a picture in your mind of Lincoln in a log cabin, it's because he just stole all of that and reused it in 1860. So now to the 1848 election, the Whigs win this election. They again choose someone who they think will win over Southern votes, Zachary Taylor. But he was tired of those Southern threats where they say, if you don't do what we like, we're going to secede from the Union. Zachary Taylor's position is, you try that, I'll just go to war with you and you won't win. And he was quite threatening. You kind of picture that in what we're seeing in our own history. Ones that are going to stand up and say, go ahead and try it. And we're just getting closer and closer and closer to all-out war. Taylor hoped this tactic would avoid a lengthy debate in Congress and maintain the integrity of the nation. He tired of threats from Southern politicians claiming they would leave the Union if slavery were outlawed in the new Western territories. By October of 1849, California settlers drafted a state constitution outlawing slavery and applied for statehood. The delicate ratio of slave to free states in the government was upset by this development pushing calmer politicians to search for a compromise. Esteemed politician Henry Clay, known as the Great Compromiser from his previous work in times of crisis, recognized the debate was spiraling out of control and began searching for a resolution. Taylor opposed Clay's proposal and continued claiming he would use military force rather than compromise. In 1844, they decide to annex Texas. 1845, they go to war with Mexico over Texas. By 1846, they're looking at all three: Texas, California, Oregon. California doesn't want to be a territory. The gold rush is occurring. California is a vast area and their population is booming, and they want to become a state. You have the same issue in the history of 1848 to 1850 that you had in 1818, Missouri and Maine. What do you do with these new states? So California doesn't want slavery. What do you do now when you make it a state? The South says that if slavery is outlawed in these new Western states, they will secede from the Union. So the 1844 choice to rapidly expand the United States sets off this sectional crisis. And this is what the 1850 Compromise is all about. The North says we want California as a free state. It upsets the free state, slave state balance. In steps Henry Clay, and what they need is a compromise. He's deathly ill, but he throws his energy into this compromise. Zachary Taylor doesn't want the compromise. He won't sign it. Taylor dies after 18 months in office. In steps Millard Fillmore. He's a pro-business Northerner. People thought he would balance this Southern Taylor. But whereas Taylor wouldn't sign the compromise, he dies in 1850 and Millard Fillmore signs it. Millard Fillmore was personally opposed to slavery, as was Henry Clay, but their argument was the priority is the safety of the Union and upholding a plain reading of the Constitution. So in 1850, to preserve the Union, a Whig Northern president signs a Whig written compromise. We're going to summarize, and then in our next study, we'll go into Abraham Lincoln. Henry Clay died in 1852, and Abraham Lincoln gave his eulogy 8 years before he was nominated for president. So we have the political life of Henry Clay from 1798 to 1852, the Great Compromiser. His three main compromises were the Missouri to preserve the 1818 to 1821 Missouri to preserve the Union, the 1833 Tariff Compromise to preserve the Union, and the 1850 Compromise to preserve the Union. He based his foundation on a plain reading of the Constitution over his personal convictions, and he prided himself on being a centrist, not a radical extreme abolitionist. He founded the Whig Party that later became the Republican Party under Lincoln. They won 2 elections, but had 4 presidents in office because both of their presidents died. In 1840, they compromised, and that turned the course of the United States. In 1844, they lost because of that compromise. In 1848, again, they're trying to balance their election ticket, and the vice president signs the 1850 Compromise. We've looked at those 3 compromises and 3 elections. We need to think about how much more reasonable their position is. If you want to turn the course of America, you have to win the election. And if you want a high chance of winning that election, you want a candidate that can get enough votes. Someone that can appeal to both sides. Someone who's a centrist, not a radical abolitionist. That way, they can gradually end slavery and preserve the Union. Isn't there a place for compromise? Whatever we feel, don't the states have the freedom to choose for themselves? Shouldn't we respect their individual decisions or how to run their own states? The right to do that is written into the Constitution. So whatever they believed about slavery, doesn't their position seem reasonable? That's why Henry Clay today is revered as a hero of his time, someone who wasn't so stubborn he couldn't work with both sides, someone who upheld the Constitution and the Union. You would think he was on the right side of history, but Ellen White says differently. This is Polk, I think, yeah. Often referred to as the first dark horse, James K. Polk was the 11th president of the United States from 1845 to 1849, the last strong president until the Civil War. Often referred to as the first dark horse, President James K. Polk was the last of the Jacksonians to sit in the White House and the last strong president until the Civil War. He was born in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina in 1795. Studious and industrious, Polk was graduated with honors in 1818 from the University of North Carolina. As a young lawyer, he entered politics, served in the Tennessee legislature, and became a friend of Andrew Jackson. In the House of Representatives, Polk was a chief lieutenant of Jackson in his Bank War. He served as Speaker between 1835 and 1839, leaving to become governor of Tennessee. Until circumstances raised Polk's ambitions, he was a leading contender for the Democratic nomination for vice president in 1844. Both Martin Van Buren, who had been expected to win a Democratic nomination for president, and Henry Clay, who was to be the Whig nominee, tried to take the expansionist issue out of the campaign by declaring themselves opposed to the annexation of Texas. Polk, however, publicly asserted that Texas should be reannexed and all of Oregon reoccupied. The aged Jackson, correctly sensing that the people favored expansion, urged the choice of a candidate committed to the nation's manifest destiny. This view prevailed at the Democratic Convention, where Polk was nominated on the 9th ballot. So who is James K. Polk? Whigs jeered. Democrats replied Polk was the candidate who stood for expansion. He linked the Texas issue, popular in the South, with the Oregon question, attractive to the North. Polk also favored acquiring California. Even before he could take office, Congress passed a joint resolution offering annexation to Texas. In so doing, they bequeathed Polk the possibility of war with Mexico, which soon severed diplomatic relations. In his stand on Oregon, the president seemed to be risking war with Great Britain also. The 1844 Democratic platform claimed the entire Oregon area from the California boundary northward to the latitude 5440, the southern boundary of Russian Alaska. Extremists proclaimed 5440 or fight. But Polk, aware of diplomatic realities, knew that no course short of war was likely to get all of Oregon. Happily, neither he nor the British wanted a war. He offered to settle by extending the Canadian boundary along the 49th parallel from the Rockies to the Pacific. When the British minister declined, Polk reasserted the American claim to the entire area. Finally, the British settled the 49th parallel, except for southern tip of Vancouver Island. The treaty was signed in 1846. Acquisition of California proved far more difficult. Polk sent an envoy to offer Mexico up to $20 million plus settlement of the damage claims owed to the Americans in return for California and the New Mexico country. Since no Mexican leader could cede half his country and still stay in power, Polk's envoy was not received. To bring pressure, Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to the disputed area on the Rio Grande. To Mexican troops, this was aggression, and they attacked Taylor's forces. Congress declared war, and despite much northern opposition, supported the military operations. American forces won repeated victories and occupied Mexico City. Finally, in 1848, Mexico ceded New Mexico and California in return for $15 million and American assumption of the damage claims. President Polk added a vast area to the United States, but its acquisition precipitated a bitter quarrel between the North and the South over the expansion of slavery. Polk, leaving office with his health undermined from hard work, died in June of 1849. There's a biography on Polk, and that's it for there. So just a lot of history. And looking at the three compromises, the history of the Whig Party, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, and the events that directly led to the Civil War. We saw that Jefferson saw it in the 1818 Missouri Compromise and referred to it as a fire bell that we ought to see where we're headed. Any comments or any thoughts? Nobody? Are you guys still there? There's a lot of reading.
Yeah,
Yeah, yes, we're still here.
too.
Okay. So who can help us to understand this history and what it means for us?
Well, that was what I was thinking about. How does this relate to us? And well, I don't know. I was trying to think, okay, so there were three great compromises. We know that generally speaking, President Biden represents Henry Clay as the compromiser. I think that's a general idea. I don't think if she did, I don't remember if she expanded on that or not. But I was wondering how the three compromises, see, one was tariff, that was the middle one. The last one was Slave Act, Fugitive Slave Act. The first was the Missouri Compromise. I was thinking how or if that applies in our dispensation, if at all.
Well, we can start by what was the sin that filled the cup in their history.
So that was slavery.
Okay. And they're fighting over slavery, right?
Right.
And they're taking steps that are directly leading to all-out war. So maybe we need to understand the steps they're taking that are directly leading to all-out war. The fight over new states that want to come in, don't want to be slave states, or want to be slave states, don't want to upset the balance of slave states. Because they want it to be equal, huh? Still underlying in all of that is you have people that think it's perfectly okay to enslave part of the human race and abuse and beat and whatever goes on with all of that. And then you do have the staunch abolitionists. So we did get that the abolitionists couldn't really win the votes. They wouldn't get enough votes, enough support. We saw how the compromiser would choose a slaveholder as a vice president just to try to gain votes, which only got them into more trouble. So those are some of the key points I remember. Yeah, and it was all about to keep the union. And you're really not, you're trying to keep a union when you're completely divided. Trying to maintain, you know, it's interesting, all the campaigns always say, I'm going to unite the nation, going to unite the nation. And, you know, Biden has said it, they've all said it, and, you know, we're going to unite the nation. And yet, how can you unite a nation that is so polarized? You can't. So to me, I mean, I always, when I would listen to Biden say those things during the campaign, you're not going to unite people that are staunchly opposed to what you represent. How are you going to bring them into union? So then he's known for being able to work on both sides of the aisle. He's a compromiser, and that's the next study, that he's a compromiser. I'm going to read Susan's thing. Yes, I see the three groups and compromises in those fractal lines of that time period. And it's interesting how the Liberty Party in the Millerite time is a polar opposite of the Libertarian Party in our time. So compromise comes in to help with the division, but it really didn't help, did it? It only, isn't that like putting a Band-Aid? I mean, am I understanding that correctly? The compromise, isn't that just like putting a Band-Aid on?
Yeah, it's just a stopgap measure to avert war, immediate war. But you know, as Elder Tess said, I think this study right here mentioned, I think, 15 years of culture war, and I believe for our time, Elder Tess mentioned that it's been about 30 years of this culture war. And so we've been having this battle between freedom and equality for the past 30 years. And you know, the Civil War always excuse me. The Civil War always begins with the culture war, two opposing sides.
Yeah. So, and then the culture was slavery or not, right?
Yeah, slavery or no slavery. And that mentality has, I mean, the form has gone away, but like Apis bull, the spirit of slavery is still there. So it's just been brewing for the past 30 years.
And going back to, oh, go ahead, sorry.
And especially since the election of President Trump, that just now gave those who were for slavery, just now gave them the permission to be bold and come out, and they're not going away.
So in their history, because it's a history of failure, they didn't have, well, I'm trying to read, was it Polk? Was that the one that we saw came out and just, or was it Taylor? That just, I think it was Taylor that flat out just said what he was doing. Is that right? I'm just thinking of trying, because there's a history of failure and ours is a history of success. The other complication that I remember, but I don't remember it well enough, or don't understand it well enough, is that because in the Millerite history, they only had the one fractal. And so 1850, and I want to say 1844, correct? Help me if I got that wrong. Or the eight, because 1850 is the Sunday law. 1850 is when they were to go to the world. 1850 is Sunday law when we go to the world. But you had to bring two concepts because they didn't have a panium. If anybody remembers that. Does anybody remember that well enough? Yeah, me too. But you know, with what Susan said, it doesn't startle people. You know, for my own self, I never paid attention to history. So I think for us, we see it more so because it's been brought to our attention. There are people that understand history, but what's interesting is people that do understand history, you still see the mindset because you have people that understand history and see where we're headed. And you have those people on both sides defending their side as being right. But going back to what our Desire of Ages say about how you can't reason with people. So one side sees, you know, like it was in listening to the hearing the other night when I think it was one of Trump's tweets that I think that's what she was, I don't know if it was what he said, something he said, or one of his tweets that went out, I don't remember. I think he was talking to Mark Meadows. There's a quote from Mark talking to Mark Meadows, but talking about how the insurrectionists have more love than, maybe somebody remembers what he said, more love than Mark Meadows does, or I don't know if he was, but basically saying, and then he was also saying, look at how much love these people are showing, because he sat in front of the TV watching it. And to him, he saw that as love. The really bad, I don't know how many different bad parts about it there are, but he was only for himself. So he's not even able to identify a love of country. It's a love of him. Maybe I'm wrong in saying that, but he brought them to that place. I think that's what fell was that turning point. He brought them to that place to feel free to express what they did. So he's calling that what they're doing, regardless of regardless of what he thinks why they're doing it. They're fighting for their country. They're showing their love. That's how he viewed it. They're showing their love of country by the violence that took place that day. And it comes down to how do you look at how they define love. They define love completely different. So the culture today, how do we open up for discussion? How do we define that today? Take that slavery issue and put the culture of, when it comes to gender and misogyny.
That's a good point.
Anybody have thoughts that they want to put into this? Well, we started out in 2015 with, oh, go ahead, Phil, are you saying? If you were talking, Phil, we can't hear you. You're all garbled and barely
The
there, Phil.
feeling of it's still run. Okay, I think the internet is cutting out.
Okay, you were almost there right at the end. You want to try again?
Okay, how about now?
Okay.
Yeah, so what I was beginning to say, I think that that feeling of
Oh, he disappeared again. It definitely has the internet problem today. You're gone again, Phil.
or gender. I'll try again later.
Okay, I always wanted to hear what you had to say too. Oh. So I was going to say, when you go back to 2015, the election, and there's so much more to it because we need to understand Bernie Sanders and Hillary as well. And I'm just thinking on the issues of, looking at what we just looked at now and taking that to gender, we saw sex scandals come out on one that's running for president, and how quickly people were ready to just discount that as, that's his personal life. He's going to be president and it doesn't matter. The two don't mix. So there's a vote there that comes in to just makes a statement for misogyny, right? And Susan, do you want to try and talk about that? I mean, talk in today.
I don't know if it'll lag. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So, do you remember the Bernie Bros? They were called Bernie Bros.
I don't.
Okay, I was trying to look into that because bros is like a male term. And so I wondered if that had something to do, because I didn't really follow Bernie much at all, but my daughter had talked about him back during that time, Anyhow, I wondered if that had something to do with misogyny, and with what Elder Tessa's trying to bring out that we maybe didn't understand about Bernie and Hillary at that time. That's really it. I don't know a lot. That's why I kind of tossed it out there, hoping maybe somebody else knew more about it.
Anybody?
No, Susan, I haven't heard about Bernie Bros, but just as a comment to what you said about Elder Tess, I think this is coming because there's some problems there with Bernie. At least for my own thinking, I was like, oh, Bernie, he is completely on the far left. He's the guy, he's the true progressive. He's the one that wouldn't compromise. But see, I don't know that enough about the background there. So, and I think this is important that we understand this, for what's going on with the left, period. I mean, we know Biden's a centrist and compromises, wherever, it's pleasing. So how this looks with Bernie, I don't know. There was something else, somebody might have seen this as news this week with Ocasio. Something she's really riled up about. I'm not sure. Did anybody see anything on the news about that? And, she's a Sanders supporter as well. She would be a true progressive, if you want to say it that way. Yeah, that's all I really know at this point. But just know that there's going to be more information coming. As
Anybody?
well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the patriarchal system too when you brought up AOC again, because I remember watching a documentary about her and how she has such admiration for her father, because her father had taken her around, I guess, and got her interested in politics. I don't remember all the details perfectly, but now, now that you've also mentioned that, Jackie, that piece about how she was supportive of him, I think might have to do, I think they're bent towards patriarchy, male supremacy, her adoration of her father. I think something might be there too.
Yeah,
But
that could be.
I'm
very
not
true.
wise enough to put it all together yet. That's for
Well,
sure.
Yeah, you've got some good points, though. Yeah, I had something in my mind about the study. Was talking about, of course, the theme, the one that you just gave, Elaine, was on slavery, but what about the expansionism problem? And how does that look on our line as well? I don't know if anyone else had any thoughts on that. Expansionism with what it was leading to with trying to annex Oregon and California, because it was going to leave.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
Sorry. That's a good point, Jackie. Because that would even lead to the United States being the global the supremacy that we know
Yeah.
that the United States is going to gain. Um, and it would need that larger circumference of dominance,
yes,
like you're
exactly.
suggesting, to incorporate more territory and more people, or whatever, however you would phrase that.
Yeah, more populace and people, sure. But it
The-
involved a
Yeah, I
war.
could see.
It involved a war with Britain and Mexico by expanding and taking these areas of, of land, of peoples. So, whether the next study will bring any more out on that. I mean, I don't want to just make it all slavery, yeah, although that was the biggest issue. But how did things work out after this with the United States coming together, and adding more and more territory, which was causing more and more problems with these people with the Mexican race, and maybe, with Britain. We didn't have too much information in the study about what Britain had to do with it, but they were totally opposed to it, the European country. So how does that look with, where we are now? Because there's always a cause and an effect. Things lead to something else because, because of expansion and trying to grab land. We can look and see, well, what if that hadn't happened?
Not,
Phil's back. Let's see if he's holding up on the internet.
Okay.
yeah, so last
Oh,
night's Vespers by Elder Test has not yet been posted.
and your internet's just not gonna make it today.
So I'm waiting for that one. You still can't hear me? You still
No,
can't hear me?
I mean, right now I can, but it definitely goes out. That's a bummer. So let's think about this, what she did say at the Vespers last week. I pretty much had to,
No, yes, because I wanted to talk about the gray zone.
yeah, okay. I'm praying your internet will hold up because yeah, because I wanted to at least, I mean, I had to listen to it because I know a lot of you guys were picking up stuff last week. Sometimes I struggle to focus, and so but listening to it throughout the week. So here's what if I remember right, if I understand it right, she's looking at the far left and the far right, comparing and contrasting, and seeing that the far left is multilateral, multipolar, right? Is that they were using the word polar as opposed to lateral? They're the same. Are they the same thing basically when it comes to the New World Order? That and the two streams of information. One side is sees globalism, the other side sees George Bush wanted a unilateral, unipolar, to where the United States is going to be the one that's over all. Is that correct? That's the right.
That's what I understand.
And the left, the far left, is multipolar and doesn't think the United States should be involved in the business of other nations and whatever they do. But what they are alike on is they support Russia, for one, and Putin. If I understood correctly, they believe some conspiracy theories, some of the things about Ukraine, or not Crimea. Okay, let's start with that. Who understands to elaborate? And so if I understand correctly, then the gray zone is where a lot of the information has been found, and how they also, this far left supports China. Is that correct? Supports Syria. Okay, so the gray zone would be against expansionism. So what does that mean to us today? Because what we do see is, what she's showing is that there's going to be this union where they unite, but they aren't the same. They don't believe in the same things. They unite on things, but they do not come to the things they unite on from the same place.
Yes, Elaine, I took notes on that. And what you're saying is right about George Bush, the New World Order, that the US ends up on the top. This Max Blumenthal, I was Googling him, and I had kind of touched on this in the past, just kind of wondering what this, what this represents. Max Blumenthal, he supports Russia, as you just said. And I circled, let's see, it's Western imperialism that the gray zone supports or believes. Western imperialism. And what does that mean? That means the West or the United States, and whether or not they call themselves democracies, or it's a democracy that they believe in. I'm not sure. It is multipolar. It's colonialism. And it's also expansionism.
Can you define, would you define Western imperialism?
Western imperialism, it's
Yeah, that's what I thought.
its
So,
culture and not Christianity.
okay, because I think what you said, if I understood it correctly, is Blumenthal is pro-Western imperialism,
Yes,
but he can't be multipolar and pro-Western imperialism. So I think it's backwards that they're actually against, and that's what Feldes put. The gray zone is against colonialism and imperialism.
okay, so they're against imperialism and colonialism, going and taking other countries. Or nation, let's put it in another term, nation building. What is nation building?
Nation building. Say that again. What'd you say
Yeah, I say, what is nation building?
before that?
Mm,
Why'd you ask the question? I missed what you said before that about nation building.
yeah, well, I was looking at expansionism and colonialism, but gray zone does not believe that. They're not into to that way of America being great, if you want to say. They're not, the reality is the gray zone is the far left. Now, I had it on my notes that multipolar, and the bullet points under that was imperialism and colonialism.
Yeah, because that's what they're against. They're multipolar and against imperialism.
And colonialism.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, all right.
And they do believe conspiracy theories. Yes.
And, I don't want to throw something out there that's not right. Get it corrected when, we have more information coming on this.
Yeah.
Probably this, with this new video that's going to be out. So it's, and then I had, now what, this is not connected with the gray zone, but it's a culture war. It's over the culture and not Christianity. This is the test. It's not over Christianity. This is our test. Make it a little more clear here. This is our test. It's not over Christianity. It's over culture. That's where the test will be for us. I think we're already talking in that line.
Anybody else? And yeah, Troy, the far left doesn't believe that America should be involved in the affairs of others, which is puts them back to the multipolar, everybody should take care of their own selves, which was, I thought was interesting, because to me, and I've got a small mind and all this kind of stuff, but if you don't believe you should be involved in the affairs of others, and yet they support Putin.
Yeah,
So who knows how this connects to Bernie? 'Cause that's the thing, I never paid attention to Bernie. There was just something that along the way, I knew Bernie wasn't the answer, but I probably had all the wrong reasons for thinking Bernie wasn't the answer. Who knows how Bernie connects to this? Because that's what she says a lot of the people in the movement are caught in that stream, that path of freedom and liberty. How about you, Luke? You have something to say on this?
Yeah, I think she was referring to 2016, right? And the Democratic election
Yes.
between Hillary and Bernie. And the point she was making was most of us in the movement would have picked Bernie. So before we've even got to Trump versus Clinton, we've voted for the wrong person. But I think, like Phil or Logina said in the chat, she hasn't expanded on that yet. So yeah, we're interested to see where that's going.
Where Bernie connects to this, okay.
Yeah, because I mean, Bernie, I'm not sure, I could be wrong, but Bernie seemed to be a bit more far left than Hillary.
A bit more what?
A bit more left wing, a bit more radical.
Yeah,
But I think the point was, obviously with gender, we're picking the male over the female. And I did just Google Bernie Brothers. I hadn't heard of that before. And then it's kind of interesting to see the following he had.
what'd you find?
Yeah, from what I could read, he didn't, when he was asked about it, because the things they were saying, I think the things they espouse are quite sexist, and so he was kind of distancing himself from that. So I'm not sure how that group, the Bernie Brothers, there was a, let me read it again because it might have been, where is it? I might be getting a bit mixed up because there's there's some group of males that were following Bernie. I was just reading Wikipedia. Yeah, he says, yeah, the Bernie Brothers. So if I'm not mistaken, is that just some male followers that supported him? Because I know he had a brother. Bernie had an older brother. Because this is the first time I've heard of it today. So
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it either.
yeah, but definitely, I think you're right, Susan. There's definitely misogyny in there somewhere. So it'd be interesting to see if Elder Tessick goes into that and explains that a bit more. But it's kind of, scary when it's like, well, I would have picked the wrong side back in 2016 before even Trump and Clinton. So yeah.
I'm anxious for that. There was a class, right? There was a Vespers class?
Yeah, there was, and that we're trying to, I know they're very busy, so they'll get it up as soon as they can. So
Okay, good.
yeah.
has anyone watched the Rael Wallenberg Institute that was on WhatsApp? That Elder Tess recommended?
Yeah, we read that last week, and then I did watch or listen to the video of it yesterday. Yesterday? I think it was yesterday.
Yeah,
We go through it again.
yeah, I was listening to it this morning. Excellent. Yet, I mean, I just don't get things from the first time out. I have to go over it and over it, get it into the brain.
Not the only one, Jackie.
But, 2017, that was done. And the title was Do Not Dare Tell Me Human Rights Are Not Universal. And that was what the whole speech was on. Just incredible, the amount of inhumanity towards inhumanity. It's just horrible. And I just caught so much more the second time around. I will listen to it again and again. And I mean, this is what we're seeing in this world, what God sees in this world going on. And it's just horrible. With, of course, on the side of women, the misogyny, the anti-abortion, human rights in order to choose. He's bringing out examples of what's going on and what's happening, different countries that he travels to, and girls that have gotten abortions and been in prison for 30 years down in South America. It's horrible.
I don't think
Having an abortion.
I think the ones he talks about, didn't they did, I don't, if I remember correctly, it wasn't that they had abortions, they lost their babies and they were accused of abortions. Is that correct?
Accused of abortions. Pardon me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And that's
but
what's
the
coming.
punishment is just totally inhumane.
And that's what's coming with Roe v. Wade, is how you gonna know the difference between a miscarriage or a stillbirth and saying that the woman did something to cause it to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's going to create a real problem.
and going to jail for it. And then now you have, Texas seems to be the ones putting their foot in the water. I don't know if that's the right expression. Texas is like this little testing ground of what it's like to turn the citizens into vigilantes.
Yeah.
Kind of like the canary down the mine to see what you can get away with, kind of thing.
Yeah. And
Yeah. Test tape.
and what you're seeing is, what we see is people actually really enjoy it. You get the people that enjoy, that are going to get joy out of turning somebody in, as opposed to protecting and caring for somebody.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting too that Texas has become the state of protect the guns and don't take our guns away from us. And here they had the school shooting. And now, it's all over the world. It's gone all over the world. And it seems like the tip of the iceberg for now. We've got to do something about these guns. Just do something to stop this. All in the state of Texas.
I think I shared it.
Abortions and guns.
Yeah, I think I shared it maybe it was on Wednesday, I don't remember. But an article that I was reading on a Republican congressman from Colorado, who, of all the excuses they give for why we need guns, those guns, particularly assault rifles, was because people that own land and have ranches, they need them to kill the squirrels before the squirrels get their chickens.
Yeah.
And, I'm like, there is no reason for that kind of a gun other than pleasure if you're out killing squirrels with it.
Oh, wow.
That's my opinion.
Yeah.
I think
I
Yeah.
agree,
Agree.
agree.
I didn't know, do squirrels eat chickens? Like, is that a thing?
I don't know. He was talking about different, he gave different animals. I think he said skunks and I think the person who wrote the article used the word varmints.
Yeah,
And from chasing and getting their chickens and different people needing to protect their land from varmints, critters.
Yeah,
And I do have I don't know, wrong to say this, just the way that I know it, my brother-in-law's kind of up there with the redneck and the guns and Trump supporter and all of that too. And they live on land and property and it's going out and shooting the gophers and things like that. I don't know that he has an assault rifle. I don't know, but I just know that there's pleasure in the hunt, you know? And so to take it to the level that that's the excuse you're using to defend anybody being able to get their hands on an assault rifle. In other words, we got to save our chickens, but we'll let the children die.
yeah. It's terrible.
And yet we're pro-life.
How a hypocrisy of it all.
Yeah, and yet they're pro-life
Yeah,
to save the unborn baby,
it's just
but they
crazy.
won't save the ones that are living already here.
Exactly.
it's just crazy, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, I really don't get it. Coming from Australia, where it's like we had one massacre in 1996, and then the government took away all. You know, I don't even think we were allowed assault rifles, but I mean, you don't need them. But like semi-automatic weapons, they had a big buyback scheme, and we never had a massacre again. So then coming over here, and it's just like so. Almost everyone's desensitized to it, you know, but they're also so opinionated, and there's such a double standard with, like you said, pro-life with abortion, but we've got to remember they're using different methodology as well. Like, it's easy for us to see, it's easy for us to compare and contrast and that kind of thing, but they're not using the same rules with their interpretation of not only the Bible for the right-wing conservative Protestants, but just the rest of society too. But yeah, it's kind of scary.
Yeah, exactly.
wow. Yeah, Phil put in there, true hunters don't use assault rifles. Too many bullets only damage the meat. And men do use the word hunt for seducing. Yes, they do. So, wow. Well, we'll be watching for that class. And we can go ahead and break early for lunch. Then come back we'll look at the Biden study after this, now that we've done this one. If anybody wants to go through the Biden study instead of me reading through it, feel free to volunteer. Luke, would you like to close us in prayer?
Yeah, sure. God in heaven, we thank you for once again another blessed study where we can review the things that the histories that may seem so simple on one level, but when we delve into them, we see the complex aspects of it. And we thank you for the clarity that we can gain in understanding through parable methodology. We see the societal changes and how these have affected us as we've progressed, but we pray we may come out of the bad things of society that we've imbibed. We pray for your Holy Spirit to continue to convict us of these things as the midnight cry continues to show us the errors of our ways. We thank you for the leaders, especially in our movement, Lord, Elder Tess, Elder Parminda, the rest of the workers in the field. We pray especially for, and we're thankful for Elaine and the work that she's doing. We lift her up and we support her and strengthen her in everything that she's doing to continue to lead us in this part of America and help us gain a more fuller understanding of who you are, that we may represent to others around us in the truest sense your character, that they may enter your kingdom. We thank you for the Sabbath. Continue to be with us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen, Lord.